Every international transaction begins with a contract of sale. This document identifies the goods being sold, who organizes their physical movement, who clears them through customs, and exactly when risk passes from seller to buyer. But the contract of sale does not move the cargo. For that, you need a contract of carriage. This separate agreement between the shipper and carrier sets out the places of receipt and delivery and determines when freight is paid. Because you have two distinct contracts operating side by side, you create immediate points of friction. The contract of sale might say the buyer pays for shipping, but the contract of carriage requires the shipper to pay up front. You also have the variables of who handles customs duties in foreign jurisdictions and exactly when the liability for the physical cargo transfers. If a container is suspended over the water halfway between a dock crane and a cargo vessel and the cable snaps, someone must pay. If overlapping liabilities between the buyer, the seller, and the carrier are not precisely mapped, a single dropped container becomes a catastrophic legal dispute. International trade structurally fails without a standardized, independent legal mechanism to bridge the gap between commercial sales agreements and physical logistics. The solution is the ICC's Incoterms, an 11-rule framework resolving contractual friction by defining who contracts transport and where risk passes. But it has limits. Incoterms do not dictate property title transfer, payment methods, or required documents. They exist purely to allocate the physical costs, the legal risk, and the customs responsibilities along a physical route. The framework is iterative. The latest version is Incoterms 2020, but 2010 remains valid. Because definitions occasionally shift, you must state the specific version year in the contract to be legally binding. Successful trade requires mapping these mechanical rules onto a geographic timeline, treating them as active liability markers rather than static definitions. This chart maps the master geographic timeline of global trade, tracking the cargo's journey from the seller's facility at the origin, through the export port, across the main transit leg, into the import port, and finally to the buyer's destination. Across this route, we have to track two independent variables. We will use a blue bar for cost responsibility, who pays for the physical transport, and a red bar for risk transfer, who legally assumes the loss if the cargo sinks, burns, or is stolen. We start at the extreme left with the E term, EXW, or Ex Works. Here, the seller assumes the absolute minimum liability. The seller simply packages the goods and makes them available at their own facility. Both cost and risk transfer to the buyer immediately at the origin. The buyer has to organize the loading, the export clearance, and the entire global transit. If we slide the scale to the opposite extreme, we hit the D terms, DAP, DPU, and DDP. Under these terms, the seller takes on the maximum operational burden. They arrange the main transport, and both the financial cost and the physical risk stay with the seller all the way to the destination node. One of the key updates in the 2020 rules was the refinement of a specific D term. The old rule, DAT, delivered at terminal, was renamed DPU, delivered at place unloaded. This clarifies that the seller is responsible for the cost and risk of actually unloading the cargo at the destination, whether that destination is a terminal, a warehouse, or an open lot. But these extremes carry hidden jurisdictional traps. Under EXW, the buyer is responsible for clearing export customs in the seller's country. Under DDP, the seller must clear import customs and pay duties in the buyer's country. XWY and DDP force one party to absorb all the friction of dealing with foreign tax and customs authorities. For complex cross-border transactions, polar opposites rarely work. You usually need to split the burden. This brings us to the middle ground, the F terms, which include FAS, FOB, and FCA. Under F terms, the seller pays the costs and holds the legal risk strictly until the cargo is handed over to the main carrier at the export port. At that exact geographic location, the seller's liability ends. The buyer then takes over. The buyer controls the main leg of carriage, negotiates the ocean freight rates, pays the shipping line, and assumes all risk of loss while the vessel is at sea.
Up to this point in the Incoterms framework, the financial cost of transit and the legal risk of loss have moved perfectly in tandem. Where the blue bar stops, the red bar stops. The C terms, CFR, CIF, CPT, and CIP, break the framework's established pattern of synchronized liability. Under a C term, the seller has a financial obligation to arrange and pay for the main carriage. They pay the freight cost all the way to the import port. But here is the decoupling mechanism. The risk passes from the seller to the buyer at the origin, entirely separated from the payment of freight. This creates a legal paradox. The buyer legally accepts the risk of cargo loss for the entire ocean voyage, even though the seller is the one paying the shipping line and routing the cargo. Sellers use C terms because it allows them to control their own export logistics and secure bulk freight discounts with carriers without having to carry marine liability on their balance sheet. But it leaves the buyer highly vulnerable. The buyer owns the risk during transit, but has no direct control over the carrier the seller selected. Assuming that risk and cost transfer at the same time is the most common and most expensive legal error practitioners make. If the ship sinks, the buyer still has to pay the seller for the goods because risk transferred before the vessel even left the dock. Because the C terms create a massive gap where the buyer holds the risk but doesn't control the freight, explicit insurance mandates must be layered into the contract. The rules specify exactly what kind of insurance the seller must purchase for the buyer's benefit. Under CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, the seller pays for the marine insurance. However, Incoterms 2020 dictates that CIF only requires Institute Cargo Clause C. This is an intentionally lower level of cover that comes with multiple exclusions. This contrasts directly with the updated rules for CIP, carriage and insurance paid to. As of 2020, if you use CIP, the seller is legally mandated to provide comprehensive all-risks cover under Institute Cargo Clause A. You cannot simply pick a C term based on routing preferences. The decision must be based strictly on the mathematical value of the cargo and the exact level of Institute cargo coverage that value requires to mitigate the transit gap. The final step in applying Incoterms is matching the rule to the physical reality of the transport. The 11 rules are strictly bifurcated. 4 specific terms, FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF, are restricted exclusively to sea and inland waterway transport. The remaining 7 rules, including FCA, CPT, and DPU, are designed for any mode of transport, including complex multimodal routes combining trucks, rail, and air. A massive vulnerability across the logistics industry is the misapplication of traditional maritime terms to modern containerized freight. Traditional maritime terms like FOB dictate that risk passes when the cargo is loaded onto the vessel. But in modern shipping, containers are dropped off at inland rail yards or terminal yards days before the ship arrives. If a hurricane hits the terminal while the container is sitting on the tarmac, the risk hasn't legally passed to the buyer yet, even though the seller lost physical control of the goods days ago. To fix this, practitioners handling containerized freight should swap FOB for FCA, or swap the destination terms for DPU. These multimodal terms allow the exact point of risk transfer to be set at the inland concrete depot, perfectly matching the operational reality of the handoff. Utilizing the correct multimodal term prevents liability failures regarding terminal handling charges and preloading cargo damage. Selecting an Incoterm is the ultimate expression of a company's supply chain strategy. Securing the absolute cheapest ocean freight rate is entirely useless if the associated legal risk profile exposes the business to millions in unrecoverable losses. For the protection to hold, the contract of sale must explicitly state 3 things: the chosen 3-letter rule, the precisely named geographic place of delivery, and the version year of the Incoterms framework being used. The entire system relies on knowing exactly where your financial cost ends and exactly where your physical risk begins. Mastering this mechanical framework establishes Incoterms as a primary tool for corporate risk management, providing the precision necessary to handle international liabilities.